is we have a common understanding of wealth. And so the common understanding of wealth is external conditions, right? It's economics, it's levels of assets, levels of income. And that leads to levels of influence and levels of maybe control or power. One of my mentors actually called it, he said, true wealth, notice he puts a modifier on wealth. True wealth is all the things money can't buy and death can't take away, like health, a close family, deep friendships, accountability, generosity, optimism, these kinds of things.
Welcome to the Mindful Wealth Podcast. Stop financializing everything. What is true wealth? What's the right metric for success? Much of how we live presupposes that our incomes or spending is a good measuring stick. But can you really quantify success with a bank balance? Or should we include softer things like learning and love, generosity and gratitude, and happiness and well-being? Welcome to the Mindful Wealth Podcast, where we seek advice to help us lead wealthier lives and extend success to a wider community. And now, your hosts, Jonathan DeYoe and Terrie Shower.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Mindful Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I interview my co-host, Jonathan DeYoe. Now, Jonathan has a fascinating background. He was first a graduate student in comparative religion who focused on Buddhism and Eastern thought, and then after that, got into the financial services industry to start his investment firm. Now, I got to know Jonathan actually some years ago by reading his book, Mindful Money. And what makes the book so interesting is exactly the fact that it's in between the world of financial services and spirituality on the other hand. And when I got the idea to start a podcast, I really thought there's no one else I'd rather do this with than Jonathan. So without further ado, please enjoy this fascinating conversation with my co-host, Jonathan DeYoe.
Hello, and this is the second episode of the Mindful Wealth Podcast. And this is the beginning episodes where we kind of get to know each other, talk a little bit about where we're coming from. And I have the pleasure today of interviewing Jonathan DeYoe, my co-host, with returning the favor of giving him some of the tough questions he gave me last week. So I'm excited to do this. And I thought we could just start off. Jonathan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you do and what brought you to do what you do.
So a little bit of today and then a little bit of history.
Exactly.
So today, I think the most important things that we have to say is I'm a father and I got 2 great kids, and I have a wife that puts up with all of my drive and over commitment to work, which is fantastic. She's great. And, on the side of those things, I run a financial education, planning and investment firm. And the more interesting story is how that comes about. Long time ago, back in high school, my friends would have told you that my future life would be something to do with investing or something to do with money. And I didn't know what that was going to be like, but they knew that that's the direction I was going, because I had a deep interest in markets and economies when I was a kid, because we didn't have anything, and I saw that as an avenue to getting. And so that's where it starts. And then I do a lot of research and I do a lot of study through high school. And I go to college for finance, but within a year of finance education in college, I was bored out of my mind. And so I started studying philosophy, and philosophy was so just fun and engaging. And I loved it. I loved writing 20-page papers in college. I loved it in grad school. And I ended up going to grad school to study comparative religion. So there's still this finance thing in the back of my mind, but I studied this comparative religion, and I started getting deep into Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism specifically. And I started meditating. And about 2.5 years, maybe 3 years into my master's program, I had the intention of going on and getting a PhD and being an academic. I learned that about you last time, and I was surprised. That was cool. But for me, it was a little different, because I had a buddy who was on the same path as myself, and he knew Chinese, and he could read Japanese, and he could read Hindi, and he could read Sanskrit, and he could do Latin, German, and French. He could read all the original languages. And I was just like, there's no way I'm going to compete with this guy. So I have to do something else. And besides, I want to practice more than I want to study anymore. So at that point, I had to find a job. I had a degree in philosophy, and I had dropped out of a program in Buddhist studies. That doesn't get you a job.
Good luck.
There's no job for that. And I had debt now and all that, the usual story. And I looked around and I was like, you know what? I remember this investing thing that I really, really enjoyed. And I started a 5-year, 7 different Wall Street firms career. And I learned over those 5-6 years that, I love the work with clients. I love it. It's fantastic. It just drives me. It just gives me oomph. But I hate the industry and just couldn't stand the industry. And then it took me I left and I started my own firm. That's what we do today for 20 years now. We've worked with about 200-300 families and on their personal finances and their investing. But about 10 years ago, I had a client who said, Jonathan, you have a different take on this. You should write a book. And so that's the source of Mindful Money, the book. And that's really where I had to take my philosophy and bring it to bear in my industry. And by bringing mindfulness into financial planning and into money, I think I codified the things I already thought and knew and did, but I was able to actually present that and start making it a clean part of our industry and what it is that I do every day. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
Great. It's funny getting a little bit deeper into this, and I can begin to see like the similarities of how our backgrounds and how our interests developed. So that's really interesting. And I think it's great how, you get there's such an interesting point when you join 2 fields together. Like, let's say you look at, Buddhism and financial planning, which are not 2 things that you usually see sitting at the same dinner table.
Yeah, definitely not.
But it's just such a fertile ground for new ideas to come and new perspectives. So that's, one of the things that makes me really excited about this podcast. But if I return you the question, why start a podcast? We all have busy lives. You've written a book. You're, helping families plan their finances. Why a podcast, and why this podcast?
Yeah, and this was, you said this earlier, you kind of dragged me kicking and screaming into this program. So, it started with the idea of, I was on your podcast and I thought, I've been on a few podcasts and I thought, you know what, eventually I'm going to do a podcast. And my thought was it was going to be more granular, more about the basics of building wealth. You got to save more, you got to invest intelligently, those kinds of things. And you had this idea of, let's do a socio-cultural analysis of wealth. Let's put wealth in the context of society, and let's talk about that, and let's interview people about that. And I was just like, wow, that sounds so much fun. Whereas the other would be fun as well, and I feel like I'd have a big impact the other way, and I'll probably still do that. But let's have some fun. Let's do this. And after we talked a few times, I just knew it'd be a great idea, and it'd be a great idea to do it with you. So I'm excited to work with you on this project. And it lined up. There we are.
And what about, let's say, podcasting at this historical moment? Like, we're both authors, we've both written books, and I think we've seen a little bit of, what's happening in the publishing industry, and maybe, if one can say, the diminishing influence of print media. I don't know if we can say that. Is there something about this moment that makes you think podcasting is a good idea, as opposed to, trying to get on network news or trying to use social media as a way to get your ideas out? Why a podcast specifically?
It's a great question. I think podcasting is the only, or listening to podcasts, consuming podcasts is the only thing you can do while you do everything else. Mm-hmm. Like I can't read a book and drive. I can't read a book and exercise. I can't read a book, and nor can I really engage the media world, video, CNBC or whatever. And I don't think in those places you have the opportunity to go deep, to take as deep a dive into specific topics. Whereas, CNBC, we call it, as a financial advisor that's focused on long-term planning, we call that financial pornography. And there's a lot of that out there. It's this, how do we make this, it's not about informing people. It's not about creating wisdom or creating better outcomes. It's about, how do we highlight the most egregious and most awful and most horrid and make that the headline so we get more clicks and so that we get more eyes on us, so that we make more money because we can advertise more. And that is literally the background behind the entire, click world. The more clicks you get, the more money you make, period. Okay. How do I get more clicks? And you and I, we're gonna try to get an audience on this, but we're gonna do it with deep conversation about relevant issues that are difficult to talk about. And I think there's value in that. And I told you this earlier. One of my fears is I'm gonna put my foot in my mouth a number of times. I'll do my absolute best to recognize when I do it, but I'll do it. And I look forward to being called on it by our guests or by you.
Yeah. And I think you make a really great point, and we didn't totally get to that last week, but I think the fact that a lot of the media environment that we exist in is either it's designed to keep your eyes on a specific screen in order to deliver your attention to advertisers. Yep. And that happens on network news. It happens on social media. I mean, for sure, certain podcasts, like there's now able to integrate advertising into different podcast platforms. That's a whole different topic. But I think in terms of, the democratic media that's available there, and especially to have long form conversations, I think there's something special about podcasting at the moment. And, I gave my 2 cents on that last week, but I think definitely the point about the fact that our attention is being sold to advertisers. And if the media is free, it's because you're the one they're selling you.
Yep. You are the product. If it's free,
you are the product.
Exactly. That's right.
Exactly. And so if we push that a little bit further, yeah, go ahead.
Can we promise it will never sell our listeners?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good.
Sounds like a good commitment to me.
Good.
So when we talk about some of the themes that you are looking forward to getting into, obviously being able to explore certain ideas is a motivation behind doing this podcast. I know for me, it certainly was. Are there some hot button issues that you look forward to getting into, or some specific people that you want to talk to as we go through?
Yeah, I mean, wealth is such a huge topic. Culture is such a huge topic. I find the Venn diagram of wealth and culture, laying over top of each other. I think that's going to be really interesting, that where those two things meet. But for me personally, I struggle with the idea of wealth. So I as I mentioned, I grew up with very little. My parents didn't have an income stream until I was 15 years old. So I was really interested in the topic. And then it's only been 4 or 5 years since I've been, what would be widely reviewed as successful. So the vast majority of my life, I've been struggling and trying to make it work and trying to reach goals and things like that. And part of that was the trajectory of philosophy and disagreeing with my betters in the industry and thinking they're doing it the wrong way. And, so all of this stuff goes into the idea about, okay, you leave academia, you don't have a master's, you fail over and over and over again. You love the client work, you hate the industry. Why? Why is wealth so hard? What is wealth? What is success? What does it mean? And I think my sideline into philosophy and religious studies was really trying to discover what's the meaning of life. And for me, we're not going to answer that probably. Maybe we will. That'd be cool.
Maybe one of our guests will answer it.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
But I really want to get to this idea about why we've financialized everything. No one is happy about it. We are, levels of stress, levels of suicide, levels of anxiety, the number of people that are taking pills to survive. I just wonder how much of this is because we have financialized everything. Mm-hmm. And if there is, we've determined that success is money. Mm-hmm. And I think that has killed us. Mm-hmm. I think we have to get back to what success really is. And money is important because it enables, it supports, but it's not the end. And the goal is to get to that place where we can all agree on what's the real end. And you and I will have conversations about that, I'm assuming at some point again. But yeah, until today, where I feel like I'm successful, I feel like I've done really well. I feel like I've met a lot of those goals. I don't feel wealthy. I think I fit. I'm part of the 1% in the United States. I think I pay my fair share. Maybe I don't. I'm open to that conversation. It's really interesting, difficult topic, and I think we're going to go into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, when we're talking about, again, this is like one of these kind of macro conversations that we don't get into all that often. But if you're looking at the system, the economic system that we run, commodification, which is kind of the placing a monetary value on everything that we do, is a consequence of running this kind of financial system. And there have been tremendous benefits to it in terms of increased standard of living and, all the indices of human well-being that we can look at, be it, less child mortality, or less world hunger, all these different things. I mean, that is a fallout of harnessing capitalism. But one of the darker facets of that is, as you say, the commodification of everything. And then we're left with like the human and emotional fallout of that. Yep. And, in terms of what we're going to end up maybe exploring, like how do we function with that? Because on the one hand, like we're definitely profiting from the good things that system has to offer us, and not just the 1%, but even everyone else has profited because they're living at a standard that is way above what we were doing, before the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, we're all stuck with these sticky problems, which is that now everything has a dollar value and we're running after the dollar because that's the currency that we use to exchange for everything else.
Yeah, it's nice. We can all have iPhones. Everyone has an iPhone, or its equivalent from the Google atmosphere or Microsoft atmosphere, but some people don't have, healthcare. And that's the, there's a benefit and there's a problem all wrapped up.
Yeah. But I mean, 100 years ago, no one had healthcare.
Right.
So
true.
Yeah.
Yay, now we have cell phones.
Yeah, exactly. But so if we get into a bit more of the nitty gritty of this, and we look at the two terms that make up the title of the podcast. So let's start with wealth. And how would you define wealth? It's a huge question, but if you take your best stab at it, is it a question of material possessions? Is it a question of power and influence? Or is it somehow a measure of success? Or is it maybe some version of all three? How would you address the wealth question?
Well, I think the first thing you have to say is we have a common understanding of wealth. And so the common understanding of wealth is external conditions, right? It's economics. It's levels of assets, levels of income. And that leads to levels of influence and levels of maybe control or power. One of my mentors actually called it, he said, true wealth, notice he puts a modifier on wealth. Mm-hmm. True wealth is all the things money can't buy and death can't take away, like health, a close family, deep friendships, accountability, generosity, optimism, these kinds of things. And I had a great conversation with somebody in the industry. What was his name? Doesn't matter. About 5 years ago. And he said he was at a precipice when he was about the size of my company. And he said, Jonathan, when I was your size, and he is now 10x, my size, I had a choice. I could commit to growing my business, or I could commit to having a really good family life. And at that moment, I could not have both. And he chose a big business and commitment to growth. And he told me at that moment, he said, I would not choose that way again. And so it's really interesting. He got financial wealth. He lost true wealth. So, and we can all, I think we can all remember the classic example of an Ebenezer Scrooge. You can have all the money in the world and be miserable, no friends, no family, no love. But it's a caricature, but I think we all know one or two Ebenezer Scrooges. We all know somebody who makes, money and wealth and power their end goal, and they're not happy. They're miserable, and it's an interesting dynamic. If we get the thing that is the common definition, we are not as happy as we could be, as if we sought out what true wealth is, and that's. Now, if I went to Bezos and said, are you happy? He's going to say, yeah. And it's not going to be because of his money, though. He has way more money than he needs to be happy. Like he has autonomy. He has freedom to, engage in pursuits that he loves. He continues to engage in those pursuits. Those are the things that make him happy. Those are the things that drive his true wealth. He also has incredible financial resources, incredible power. But I would say those aren't the things that make him successful. They're the things we look at and say, he's successful because of all of these things. But those things actually provide him the things that actually make him feel happy and successful and have a meaningful life. So they're a boost, they're a condition, but he has the internal conditions to go along with the external conditions. And so I'm really interested in that difference between external conditions, wealth and assets, and the internal conditions of, close family, health, and a commitment to those things.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's kind of buried in there is that, human beings live in representations and in meanings of things. Okay. There is like, the water bottle, and then there is everything that we assign to that. And I think if you take something like wealth as a measure of success, I mean, the pure dictionary definition of wealth might be, what is the dollar figure of what's in your bank account? And that's one specific metric, right? And just the same thing as like, what do you weigh when you step on the scale in the morning? That's one specific metric. And then around that metric, there are all the other things that go along with it, because wealth gives you access to certain privileges in society. It has a certain meaning. It's also a certain marker of success. So let's say that we're all engaged in a project of striving towards something. It's like the medal that some people win when they do a really good job at whatever their economic activity is.
Yeah.
And then we kind of have this thing that you alluded to, which is the good life. And I think you're beginning to sort of say how you think those two things fit together. I think in your previous answer, gave us a good idea of those things that will end up giving you a happiness dividend. So that's sort of one thing, but then how do you relate that to wealth and ambition and success? How do those two things, do you think those two things are compatible? Do you think they work together? What do you see the relationship between what's going on in the bank account and then what's happening on the other side with building the good life, or the good life as a project? What's the relationship between those two?
I like the question of relating the one to the other. Actually, I think that's an interesting way to ask the question. So many people think, I want to be wealthy, I want to be happy, and they don't think. So I don't think you can set wealth or happiness as a target, as a goal. I think that a life in search of wealth ends up poor. Maybe it's a life in search of financial wealth ends up with real poverty, meaning no friends, right? And a life in search of happiness ends up just, you're just spinning circles, right? So there's this, when you ask the relation between the target, wealth and happiness, versus the good life, I think the good life is the thing where you can actually make choices to lead a good life. You can't make choices that lead to wealth or choices that lead to happiness. You can make choices that lead to a good life. And maybe once you've made those choices, you can also have wealth and you can also have happiness. I think wealth and happiness are things that ensue from the good life. And I've phrased that before in different ways, but ensue is I think the right word. It's out of. The challenge is it doesn't guarantee.
Yes.
Living a good life doesn't guarantee wealth or happiness. It provides the highest probability of reaching those two. Yeah. And in the instance of failure, if you fail to become wealthy and happy, you've still led a good life. So it is its own reward. And you look at economic studies, cross-national studies, and you ask questions of happiness and contentment. And the classic is Bhutan versus the United States. The Bhutanese are so much happier and so much more contented in their lives than those in the United States. And they are, on a relative basis, poor, right? So happiness is great, wealth is great, but there are outcomes. We don't control outcomes. They're determined partially by our own efforts and actions and choices, but partially by luck and circumstance. And we can only control the inputs and try to have a good life and hope, continue on, persevere. And then if luck and circumstances shift and are supportive of it, we get to be wealthy and happy. That sounds like deterministic, but I do think our individual choices make a big difference. I think they're the biggest difference maker, but there's no guarantee.
Mm-hmm. No, I really I love your perspective on this, because I feel like responding to this question by saying that a certain lifestyle is a necessary but not sufficient condition. So that means that you can do everything right and still not have the precise outcome you were looking at, but it's the best chance you have, number one. And number two, one thing that will ensue from that is the fact that you will have lived a good life regardless of whether that ends up making you, wealthy or happy. But that those things, it's the best chance. It's the best chance. Yeah.
I correlate it with people confuse activity and investing. Like if I trade and buy and sell with outcomes, and it's not the activity that leads to the outcomes. Like it never is. But the entire universe of financial services, people point at that. Well, if you do this and this and this and this, you'll get that outcome. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One doesn't lead to the other. There isn't a direct line from here to there. There is a line that determines with patience and discipline and all the things that athletes understand, that anyone that goes through hardship and comes out the other end understands. It's those things. It's character that gets you there. And that brings up all kinds of issues with how we're discussing wealth in our society.
Mm-hmm. I want to, just before we move on to the next question, I want to just, you mentioned Bhutan as an example, and talking about, let's say, relative levels of happiness in different societies. And one point that I think needs to be brought up is that there's also something to do with the spread, the income spread, or the material wealth spread within a specific society. And there have been studies done that show that when there's kind of like a flat line, like let's say when everybody's poor and you can't envy your neighbor, that correlates to a higher level of contentment, even if everybody has less. Whereas these great disparities between rich and poor really end up not being good for anybody. And ironically, I think I read a study at one point of done in Brazil, which is a very polarized society in terms of the giant gap between rich and poor and very little middle class. And that when it comes down to it, nobody's happy with that, because the haves are dealing with a lot of insecurity and, a society where they feel like a lot of the population doesn't appreciate them. And then you have, the base who is maybe feeling a lack when they look at other people. So it doesn't only have to do with your material conditions, but also has to do with the variance in material conditions within a specific society.
I think that fits right in within that whole character thing. I think envy and those kinds of things are really, really important. There's also just, and this is something I try to teach my kids, because again, I was raised with very little. They're being raised with everything. And so how do I teach them to not be jerks about it? Mm-hmm. And I remember when my son was really young, I think he was like 4 or 5, and he saw, a really nice car. He saw he saw a car that looked like the little Matchbox cars he played with. It was like a Ferrari or something. And he was like, "Oh my God, Dad, that's such a cool car." And I was like, okay, we have to be wary of that, not the envy, but I'm going to have that car someday. Like that, it's just, it can be gross. And in a 5-year-old, that's fine. But you see all kinds of 40-year-olds who are doing the same thing. And that's problematic, I think.
Yeah. And so I think this leads really nicely into a conversation about social fabric. Mm. So I think we're at a moment in history where, that income disparity is really growing. And I think it's been growing anyways in the last 20 years, especially maybe more in the US than in Canada, but across the Western world in general, the middle class has been thinning out, and there's a real gulf that's developing between rich and poor. And I think the COVID moment, according to a lot of the stuff that I've read, is accentuating and precipitating that, accelerating it in a way that was, already there, but it's accelerating now. Yeah. So if we're talking about wealth in a moment where social cohesion is being threatened by these growing disparities, how can we have a conversation that's socially constructive and not divisive? Do you think that's possible, or? Yeah.
Can we have a conversation that's not socially divisive? I don't know. I doubt it. I think the reality is that the character of every individual is unique, and we're all attracted to things that make us happy, and we all repel things that make us sad, right? And so we're all fighting to improve our own thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of philosophy that gets bandied about around this stuff, and it's can we have a conversation that's not divisive? If we can realize that my winning doesn't require your losing, then maybe. But we're so far away from that. So can we get there? I don't know the path to there. I think there's a lot of folks that have to recognize that, right now you speak to the moment of the COVID moment, and we're having, people talk about a swoosh recovery or a check mark recovery and I think what we have is we have a K recovery, right? We have this moment in time where the economy is split. Whereas an enormous number of people globally, not just in the US, globally, who had low-paying jobs or were hanging on by the bottom two rungs of the ladder, don't have jobs anymore. They're just not there, and those businesses that were employing those people are going under. And the reality is that's going to be 15% of the population of the US, probably larger in other less developed places. And so there's going to be an enormous amount of poverty that is created and enhanced from this disease, and from our response to the disease, which hasn't always been the best response. So that's real. But before COVID, let's talk about that gap, or that the hollowing out of the middle class before COVID. So I read a lot of the actual numbers and the data on this, and yes, the middle class is getting smaller, but it's not at the expense. It's actually more people are getting wealthier. One of the challenges in the conversation, right? One of the challenges we have in the conversation is we are confusing anecdotes and statistics.
Yes.
So the reality is the statistics say, unemployment is improving. The statistics say that our income levels are improving. The statistics say that, the economy is getting better. And that is reality. Like, the reason the market is up and the economy is still in the hole is because the statistics say it should go up. But that covers over all kinds of specifics. That covers over statistics, hide details. And in the details, we have and even, in the United States, at least, I think this is true in Canada as well, but even people that are poor are less poor on an absolute basis. They're way more poor on a relative basis. Their lives are better than they were or would have been 20 years ago, but when they look at people that are ahead of them, they are way ahead of them. And so the idea of equalizing that, bringing people more in line, I think we do have to work on that. I think it's really, really, really important, but it's also part of the mindset that goes into it. If we say the middle class is hollowed out and that's horrible, well, if the middle class is hollowing out because more people are getting more wealthy, then that's not horrible, right? If we say that the minimum wage is dragging and it's low and it's down, but I actually saw something this morning that actually looked at people that made between the number of jobs for people making more than $26 an hour is now higher than it was before COVID. The number of jobs for people making between 15 and 26 is just lower. The number of jobs from people making 15 or less is still 30-40% less than it was. Okay, but is that a minimum wage problem? No, there's no jobs problem, and businesses can't survive paying a whole bunch of people. So my son actually has a job where he's making $25 an hour. He's 15 years old. He's working at a restaurant because other people didn't want to go back to work at a restaurant. And people are being wicked generous with tips right now. He's 15. He doesn't need that, right? But he's out there doing it, right? So this idea of the separation of the haves and have-nots, it's fraught with if you're at the top, you don't want anyone to take it away from you. If you're at the bottom, you think that everyone should take it away from those people and give it to you, or give you a leg up, or make it easier for you. If you're at the top, you go, I worked my ass off to get here. This was really, really, really hard. And so this conversation of the only way I can get ahead is if I take down them. And the only way that they can get ahead is if they take me down. That's the conversation that's killing us. It's the zero sum conversation. And it's not zero sum. It's never been zero sum. And the quicker we realize it's not zero sum, the quicker we realize that we can all be better off, we'll be better off.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important point to make. And it's actually, I find that I end up having a lot of surface conversations with people when you realize that underlying those conversations is a set of zero sum thinking. And I think that a lot of like this idea that, the sort of knee-jerk policies that target business owners and people who've accumulated some kind of material wealth. Like, yes, I think we all agree we need to have some kind of mechanism for redistributing to make sure that we don't end up with a two-tier society where there's like basically an aristocracy that gives their wealth down the generations and prevents anyone else from getting in. But at the same time, it's true that if you start like in this zero sum thing, then you're actually taking stuff away from people, because one of the motors that drives innovation, that drives people taking risks, that drives invention is the fact that there are real world rewards for those processes. And if you take the rewards out of the game, or you somehow diminish the value of those rewards, are you not at the same time just creating mediocrity by default?
I actually don't think it's that. I don't think it's that clear, because I totally agree with everything you said. There's rewards that causes a lot of people to work towards those rewards. But literally this morning, I read something about Elon Musk. And there was a time when both SpaceX and Tesla were, on the brink of failure. And those are both things that we want. We want Tesla because we want that technology and innovation, and we want SpaceX because we want to have that, the potential for colonizing Mars or space exploration, or, all the things that SpaceX does. And there was a point where they were both going to die. They were both going to go under. And, he's got a pretty good life. Elon Musk, he didn't have to do this. He invested something like $100 million into Tesla at the time, and like 10 million into SpaceX at the time to save them. And the question is, the specific question here is, would Elon Musk have done that if there wasn't a potential for $1 billion payoff? And it's a good question, because Elon Musk is already wealthy. He doesn't need $1 billion payoff, and he is passionate about global warming. He is passionate about the electric vehicle, about solar, and about getting this Mars just in case we destroy our planet. So there's somebody that may not require a financial reward to make that investment. He may actually be trying to save us. I'm not making a call either way, but I do think there are situations where you'll have people that'll do fantastic things, invest incredible sums without the expectation of payoff. But I think that's an anecdote. Going back to the statistics versus anecdotes, incentives matter. And I think we have an incentive structure that does reward people. I don't know what the right amount of reward is. I don't know what the right amount of incentive is, because incentives, if you've ever read Freakonomics, incentives also go the other way. Incentives also hurt us. And so how much wealth is necessary? How much incentive is necessary to drive innovation? I think that, just speaking about my home culture here, I think that the last round of tax cuts were probably not necessary. I think we had fantastic innovation before that. And I think that probably we could even have fantastic innovation at even a little bit higher tax rate. I'm not pushing it for lots and lots higher, but we have serious issues now, and we need to have funding for the COVID response. We need to have funding for all the people that are not working. We need to have funding for all this. So getting into the granular thing, I want to have incentives for people to invest and for people to be desire to be successful and for people to be rewarded for that success. The question is, what is the right level of incentive? And you don't have to read far today to find, do you need $1 billion? Somebody recently said, I don't remember who it was, but maybe it was a politician, maybe it was somebody else, said there shouldn't be billionaires. There doesn't need to be billionaires. Billionaires should all be eradicated. And I'm just like, I don't know what they're promoting. I don't know what kind of eradication they're promoting, but it's having more zeros is just, we're further along in the future. Eventually there's going to be trillionaires. There will be. I don't know. We're a ways away, but eventually there will be. Anyway, so it's a question of incentive versus innovation versus how do we take care of those people that suffer the most when things fall apart?
And so if we bring this back, because I think we somehow now got up onto like a very broad societal level. And if we now bring it back to like our individual lives and what we do as like discrete actors in the lives that we have, I mean, how do you see like the pursuit of wealth? I mean, is it a goal? Is it a bank account? Is it a process? Is it a practice? What,
When you, what do you think about the pursuit of wealth? So do we really, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, wealth can't be pursued. Again, go back to Elon Musk, you can take my example. Let's just use me, rather than me talking about some vague thing that I don't know any internal drivings for it, using me. Wealth was always a driver for me, but it wasn't a driver for the sake of wealth. I wanted the things that my friends had and I couldn't have. And I wanted to be able to get on a plane and go somewhere. I didn't want to go camping. Like, I love camping. I love my family. My mom, if my mom listens to this, I don't want her to feel bad. But they did everything they could to give me a great life and a loving household, and they stayed married, and all kinds of positives came out of that. But I always wanted more. I always wanted, and that, if you're raised 15, 16 years of feeling like you can't have enough, like you can't, like that affects you. Yeah. And so it's been a fascinating thing for me in my own discovery of I want it, I have it. Now what? What is it that enabled me to get it? What is it that brought me here? And I think the most important thing for me was the drive. It was very helpful that I was white. It was very helpful that I was male. It was very helpful that my parents were married. It was very helpful that I went to college. It was very helpful that I had a public education, access to good public education. These things were all very helpful things, no question. But the thing that drives me still is the anxiety of not having, the anxiety of falling back to the crack again. And I deal with this every day. Like it bothers me every single day. I worry about it every day. And that drive, it's probably not healthy. It's probably not entirely healthy, but it's probably where I am, right? It's given me financial resources to provide for my family. And it's given me, and so now I worry about how do we enable more people to drive after their own goals? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not wealth. Mm-hmm. I have, and it's not because of the wealth that I have these things. I think I have wealth now because of these things. Like, I've maintained my health. I read every single day. I write every single day. So I'm constantly learning. I have fantastic relationships. I've got 4 really close friends. I mean, the kind of friends that will help you move, right? Really good friends.
I don't help anybody move, eh? I've been a landlord for too long. Like, I love my friends, but I will not help anybody move. I've got too many appliances left in apartments, and you don't even. Anyways.
So you're not a very good friend.
I get that as a metric of friendship. Okay.
But I have all of these things that are I think the markers of real wealth, real happiness, real potential. And I think it's having those things and continuing to have those things and keeping those things and paying attention to those things has enabled me to stretch to wealth.
Yeah. And I think that's, we're probably coming to the end of the time that we have for this episode, but I think that that's a great place to kind of start ending it off, is that the growth mindset and the fact that, look, I mean, we can go through our own personal stories, but I think if anybody checks in with themselves, there is this kind of a natural human pursuit of growth. And it can be in the service of excellence. It can be in the service of external markers, but the human being wants to grow like a leaf on a tree that wants to expand. And if you want to like harness the best or get the best out of yourself or get the best out of people, it's by providing yourself or providing them with an avenue for growth. And
absolutely. Can I be a maple? I want to be a maple leaf.
Okay, sure. You can be whatever kind of leaf you want.
I love the metaphor. I wanted to play with it.
Yeah. But anyways, no, I think that you know, when we talk, like my opinion on how we can have a, like, let's say a constructive conversation around wealth, or one that maybe begins to not be super divisive, as you say, well, like pursuing anything, pursuing human growth, no matter where you begin running your race from, is something that it's going to make your life more satisfying, and it's ultimately going to raise everybody else up, because that's also part of what it is. If it's not a zero-sum game, then it's a game where in some ways, every time you push the package of human limitations, you're making everybody else's life better. I mean, not necessarily by, like, you know, if it's in creating new weapons of mass destruction, that's a different thing. But like, if you're working in pharmaceutical research, or if you're working in like any other kind of economic activity that creates something or invents something that's useful to other people, then in some respects you're making the pie bigger. You're not taking it out of someone else's mouth. So
That's the biggest fear, is the narrative that stops people from doing that. Any narrative
Yeah.
that tells people they can't do it, that you know, they are forever stuck where they are because of whatever circumstance they have. That narrative is it's crushing, literally crushing, crushes individuals, crushes communities. So instilling the narrative, and if I have one thing that I can thank my parents for, it's they always told me you can do whatever you want in life. I mean, it was ridiculous for them to tell me that. I mean, it was silly. Like I've eaten more bologna in my lifetime than any other food. Like that was our food, right? So there was no reason for them to say, Jonathan, you could be a senator. You could run a business. You could do that. There was nothing in our history that makes it think that would be a possibility for me. But they did. They always said, you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. And I think that's the thing that's missing in many, many lives.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Unless you have any concluding words for this episode, I think we
another great conversation. Great conversation.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to this episode with my co-host, Jonathan DeYoe. If there's something you want to think about going forward after listening to this, maybe we could refer back to what Jonathan calls the distinction between internal and external conditions of success. Wealth can be a metric in the form of a bank balance or medals or some other kind of external marker of success, but it can also be something more internal in terms of contentment and satisfaction. And maybe therein lies the antidote to what Jonathan likes to call the financialization of everything. If we're able to pull ourselves out of the fact that everything is a market and everything is a commodity, and to really focus on the other things that make life meaningful, perhaps this is the beginning of mindful wealth. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Mindful Wealth Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, remember to give us a rating and leave a comment, subscribe, and share. You can find Jonathan at mindful.money, and you'll find Terrie at terrieshower.com. Their books, Mindful Money and Mindful Landlord, are available on Amazon. Look to the show notes for our guests' contact info and any links discussed in today's episode.